Some crimes are hidden. Some names are erased. Some files are redacted. What you're about to hear was never meant for the public. This case was officially closed, but the most important details were sealed up tonight. We open the file. This is Redacted, True Crime Files, long before Pablo Escobar became a name feared around the world. He was just another young hustler in the streets of Medellin. He grew up surrounded by inequality, corruption, and limited opportunity, in a city where small crimes were often the first step into much dangerous worlds. As a teenager, he moved through a series of low-level schemes, stealing cars, smuggling small goods, and running minor operations that taught him one critical lesson: money moved faster when the risk was higher. By the mid-1970s, a new opportunity was quietly taking shape in Colombia. Cocaine demand in the United States was rising rapidly, and organized networks capable of transporting large quantities were still fragmented. Escobar recognized something others had not yet fully understood. The real power was not in selling drugs on the street. It was in controlling the entire pipeline, from production to international delivery. He began by organizing small shipments, building relationships with pilots, traffickers, and corrupt officials who could move cargo through airports and borders with minimal interference. Every successful delivery funded the next, and each operation grew larger than the last. Escobar quickly proved himself as both ruthless and dependable. He paid on time. He protected his partners. And when someone betrayed him, the punishment was immediate and public. His reputation spread quickly through the criminal underworld. Soon, independent traffickers were no longer competing with him. They were joining him. Escobar built an organization that offered structure, protection, and access to international routes. What started as a loose network evolved into a centralized system capable of moving tons of cocaine every month. Money transformed everything around him. Entire neighborhoods were flooded with cash. Safe houses, private airstrips, warehouses, and fleets of vehicles appeared almost overnight. Escobar reinvested heavily into logistics, communications, and security. He treated his operation like a corporation, with clear roles, trusted lieutenants, and layers of insulation between himself and daily operations. But his rise was not driven by business strategy alone. It was powered by fear. Escobar mastered a simple and devastating principle: accept the bribe or face the bullet. This approach allowed him to neutralize police officers, airport workers, customs agents, and politicians with equal efficiency. The cost of cooperation was low. The cost of resistance was lethal. As profits exploded, Escobar began to see himself not just as a trafficker, but as an untouchable figure. He built homes that looked like private fortresses. He surrounded himself with armed guards. He financed public projects in poor communities, buying loyalty and protection from the very people the state had long ignored. By the early 1980s, Escobar was no longer a rising criminal. He had become the central engine of an international cocaine empire. Medellin was transformed into the beating heart of a global supply chain, and Escobar stood at its center. Richer than most corporations and more powerful than many. Public officials, what began as street crime, had evolved into something far larger. A private empire with its own rules, its own justice, and its own army. And from that moment forward, bringing it down would require more than local police. It would take a global response. As Pablo Escobar's organization expanded, its greatest challenge was no longer moving cocaine. It was protecting the empire from the government itself. Every shipment, Every airstrip, every warehouse depended on one fragile condition: silence. The Medellin Cartel built that silence carefully and systematically at street level. Control came first through money. Young men from the poorest neighborhoods were recruited as drivers, guards, and lookouts. For many of them, the cartel offered something the state never had: stable income, protection for their families, and a sense of belonging. Entire communities became dependent on cartel money. When police entered these neighborhoods, they were seen long before they reached their targets, but loyalty alone was never enough. Escobar and his lieutenants relied on a brutal two-track strategy that became infamous across Colombia: bribes for cooperation, violence for resistance. Police officers were paid to lose files. Judges were paid to delay hearings. Airport workers were paid to ignore cargo. Politicians were paid to stay quiet. The system was not corrupted from the top down. It was corrupted at every level at once. Even low-ranking clerks and court employees were placed on payrolls, ensuring that sensitive information about warrants, investigations, and witness lists leaked out almost immediately. When money failed, fear took over. The Medellin Cartel introduced a level of violence that reshaped daily life. Investigators, journalists, prosecutors, and political figures were openly targeted. Assassinations were no longer hidden. They were public statements. Each killing sent a clear message to anyone who considered interfering with the organization. The goal was not simply to remove individuals. It was to create hesitation, to make every official pause before opening a file, to make every judge reconsider a ruling, to make every witness wonder whether speaking was worth the risk. Soon, entire institutions began to operate under silent pressure. Inside police departments, officers avoided cases connected to the cartel. In the courts, hearings were postponed repeatedly. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses withdrew. Investigations collapsed before they ever reached trial. The cartel did not need full control of the government. It only needed paralysis at the political level. Escobar pursued something even more dangerous: legitimacy. He presented himself as a public benefactor. He funded housing projects, sports facilities, and community programs in some of the poorest areas of Medellin. Cameras captured him handing out keys to new homes and speaking to families who had never received help from the state. To many citizens, especially those abandoned by public institutions, Escobar appeared less like a criminal and more like a powerful protector. That image served two purposes. It built a human shield around him, making it harder for authorities to act without public backlash, and it gave him access to political circles that would have otherwise been closed to a man with his background. Behind the scenes, however, the violence never slowed. By the early 1980s, the Medellin Cartel had effectively turned fear into a governing tool. Streets were controlled by paid enforcers. Information flowed directly into cartel hands, and political decisions were quietly shaped by the knowledge that defiance could carry deadly consequences. Colombia still had laws. It still had courts. It still had police. But in large parts of the country, the Medellin Cartel had created a shadow system of power that operated faster, enforced harder, and punished without mercy. For years, the violence surrounding the Medellin Cartel was seen by much of the world as Colombia's internal crisis, a dangerous criminal problem, but a distant one. That perception began to collapse as cocaine poured into American cities at an unprecedented scale. By the early 1980s, The cartel's distribution network stretched far beyond South America. Shipments moved through the Caribbean, Central America, and Mexico, then across land routes and coastal drop points into the United States. Miami, Los Angeles, New York, and Houston became key entry hubs. From there, cocaine was pushed into nearly every major market in the country. The volume was staggering. What had once been small smuggling operations turned into industrial-scale trafficking. Entire aircraft were dedicated to moving cocaine north. Maritime routes expanded through fishing boats, speedboats, and cargo ships. Every successful delivery fed a cycle of reinvestment that made the next shipment larger and harder to intercept. As cocaine availability exploded, so did its social and economic impact. Emergency rooms saw rising overdoses. Street-level violence increased as local gangs fought over territory supplied by cartel distributors. Law enforcement agencies began connecting the surge in narcotics, weapons, and organized crime activity to a single source network operating thousands of miles away. The Medellin Cartel was no longer just exporting drugs. It was exporting instability. American investigators soon realized that traditional domestic drug enforcement could not reach the core of the problem. Arresting street dealers barely slowed the flow. Cutting off one distributor simply opened space for another. The real control remained overseas, where production, financing, and logistics were coordinated from Colombia. This is where the threat became international. The scale of the cartel's profits allowed it to outspend and outmaneuver many local authorities. Corruption was no longer limited to Colombia. Bribery networks extended into transit countries, ports, and private transport companies. Intelligence sharing between criminal groups allowed traffickers to reroute shipments. In real time, whenever law enforcement pressure increased, the cartel adapted faster than any single agency could. For the United States, the implications were clear. As long as the leadership of the Medellin Cartel remained untouched, the cocaine supply would continue to expand. Regardless of how many arrests were made on American soil, that reality forced a strategic shift. The fight against the cartel could no longer be handled only through domestic policing. It required international coordination, intelligence sharing, surveillance operations, and direct cooperation with Colombian authorities. For the first time, American drug enforcement efforts focused not just on intercepting shipments, but on dismantling the command structure behind them. Escobar himself became a central target, not simply because of the drugs, but because his organization had evolved into a destabilizing force capable of influencing governments, disrupting regional security, and fueling violence across multiple countries. The Medellin Cartel had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer viewed as a powerful criminal group operating abroad. It was now seen as a transnational threat to public safety and political stability, one that could only be confronted through joint operations, shared intelligence, and a sustained international manhunt. From that moment forward, the pursuit of the cartel was no longer Colombia's fight alone. It had become a global priority as the Medellin Cartel's reach expanded across borders. Law enforcement agencies were forced to confront a difficult truth. No single country had the tools, jurisdiction, or intelligence access needed to dismantle an organization that operated seamlessly across continents. Behind closed doors, a new approach began to take shape. Colombian security forces and United States drug enforcement officials quietly opened permanent channels of cooperation. Information that had once moved slowly through diplomatic offices was now shared directly between investigators, analysts, and field teams. Flight logs, intercepted communications, financial records, and informant reports were pooled into a single intelligence picture. This collaboration marked a major shift. For the first time, the pursuit of Pablo Escobar and his inner circle was treated as a unified operation, rather than a collection of parallel investigations. Analysts began mapping trafficking routes, identifying safe houses, and tracing money flows across multiple countries at once. Patterns emerged that no single agency could have detected alone. A specialized unit was formed inside Colombia with one clear mission: locate Escobar and dismantle the leadership of the Medellin Cartel. The group operated with unusual secrecy. Personnel were carefully vetted. Movements were restricted. Even within government institutions, only a small number of officials were informed about operational details. This level of compartmentalization was necessary. The cartel's ability to penetrate law enforcement had already been proven. The new task force relied heavily on intelligence-driven operations. Rather than reacting to bombings or assassinations, teams began focusing on identifying the network that kept Escobar hidden. Couriers, phone operators, drivers, and trusted intermediaries were quietly monitored. Each arrest was designed to expose another layer of the organization. Technology played an increasingly important role. Radio intercepts, signal monitoring, and communication analysis allowed investigators to reconstruct conversations and movements without direct contact. Analysts studied call patterns, duration, and timing to identify command links between Escobar and his lieutenants. Even brief communications became valuable indicators of location and hierarchy at the same time. Informant recruitment intensified. Former traffickers, disgruntled associates, and frightened intermediaries were approached with protection offers and reduced sentences. Many provided partial information. Some offered misleading leads. Others delivered critical insight into how Escobar rotated hideouts, communicated with family members, and moved between safe locations. Trust was fragile. Every tip carried the risk of being a trap. Every operation carried the possibility that information had leaked before teams even arrived on scene. Yet slowly, the intelligence picture sharpened. The joint efforts began to isolate Escobar from the broader cartel infrastructure. Supply chains were disrupted. Financial channels were targeted. Senior operatives were captured or forced into hiding. As pressure increased, Escobar's communications grew shorter and more cautious. His movements became more erratic. The manhunt was no longer symbolic. It was becoming operational. What had once been a distant objective was now a daily pursuit driven by surveillance logs, intercepted signals, and a growing web of informants. The hunt for Pablo Escobar had moved from political promise to coordinated, international reality as pressure from the joint manhunt intensified. Pablo Escobar made a decision that would permanently change Colombia's history. Instead of retreating quietly, he chose open confrontation. He declared war on the state. For Escobar, violence was no longer only a tool to protect shipments or eliminate rivals. It became a political weapon. His objective shifted from maintaining silence to forcing the government itself into submission. The message was simple. If authorities continued pursuing him, the country would pay the price. Bombings began to tear through public spaces. Police stations, government buildings, newspapers, and commercial centers were targeted. Ordinary civilians became collateral victims in a campaign designed to create fear on a national scale. Every explosion reminded the public that Escobar could strike anywhere. At any time, assassinations escalated alongside the bombings. Judges, prosecutors, senior police officers, intelligence officials, and politicians were hunted with precision. Hit teams were dispatched with photographs, addresses, and daily routines. Many victims were killed in front of their families or colleagues. The brutality was deliberate. It was meant to strip away any illusion of safety for those who continued to work against the cartel. Journalists were also targeted. Reporters who investigated Escobar's finances, political ambitions, or violent operations received threats. Some were murdered. Others fled the country. Public information itself became a battlefield. Escobar understood that controlling fear also meant controlling what people were willing to say. The most powerful pressure point, however, was extradition. That Escobar feared being sent to the United States more than any prison in Colombia. Extradition represented loss of influence, isolation from his network, and a justice system he could not easily corrupt. To stop it, he used terror to influence national policy. Kidnappings of prominent figures became bargaining chips. Relatives of politicians, journalists, and wealthy families were taken and held in secret locations. Each hostage increased pressure on the government to negotiate. The violence was not random, it followed political moments. When extradition treaties were debated, attacks surged. When lawmakers discussed tougher security laws, killings followed. Escobar carefully timed his operations to coincide with government decisions, turning every vote and public statement into a potential trigger for retaliation. Inside government institutions, fear began to shape behavior. Officials avoided high-profile cases. Judges requested transfers or resigned. Police commanders rotated frequently to reduce exposure. Investigators limited travel routes and public appearances. The cost of doing their jobs had become personal. For Escobar, this strategy appeared to work. Public exhaustion grew. Citizens demanded peace. Political leaders faced mounting pressure to find any solution that would stop the bloodshed. Behind closed doors, discussions of negotiation replaced discussions of capture. Yet this campaign carried a hidden consequence. By attacking the state so openly, Escobar eliminated any remaining space for compromise. He unified political rivals, security agencies, and international partners around a single objective. His violence removed ambiguity. It clarified who the enemy was. The war he launched to protect himself ultimately transformed him into the highest priority target in the country. Escobar believed terror could force surrender. Instead, it hardened resolve, and in doing so, he pushed the manhunt into a new and far more aggressive phase. As the war with the state intensified, the Medellin Cartel began to fracture from within. What had once operated as a tightly controlled hierarchy slowly turned into a network driven by fear, suspicion, and survival. Escobar's greatest strength had always been loyalty, but loyalty built on intimidation is fragile. Years of constant pressure forced his inner circle into permanent hiding. Meetings became rare. Communication channels were reduced to short, coded exchanges. Orders were relayed through multiple intermediaries, increasing delays and misunderstandings. The very secrecy meant to protect the organization began to weaken its ability to function. Paranoia spread quickly. Escobar became convinced that informants were embedded inside his network. Associates who had once been trusted with sensitive logistics were suddenly excluded from decisions. Others were placed under surveillance by Escobar's own security teams. Some were interrogated. A few disappeared. These internal purges created a climate of terror. Senior operatives realized that survival no longer depended only on avoiding law enforcement. It also depended on avoiding Escobar himself. Mistakes, delays, or rumors could now be interpreted as betrayal. At the same time, profits were shrinking. Intensified surveillance disrupted air routes. Warehouses were raided. Couriers were arrested. Payment channels were frozen. The massive cash flow that had once stabilized the cartel was no longer reliable. For many mid-level commanders and logistical coordinators, the risk had started to outweigh the reward. That shift created opportunity for investigators. Law enforcement agencies focused heavily on individuals who were isolated, fearful, or under internal suspicion. Quiet approaches were made through lawyers, relatives, and intermediaries. Protection programs, relocation offers, and reduced sentences were placed on the table. Some refused, others listened, a few agreed to cooperate, not out of loyalty to the state, but out of desperation. Each defection exposed another fragment of the cartel's structure. Names of couriers, safehouse locations, communication habits, financial handlers, security rotation schedules. None of the information alone was decisive, but together it allowed analysts to reconstruct the organization layer by layer. Escobar underestimated how damaging partial intelligence could be. He believed that as long as his core location remained secret, his empire could survive. What he failed to recognize was that isolating himself had made his lieutenants vulnerable. Without his constant presence, local commanders began making independent decisions. Rivalries resurfaced. Disputes over territory and profits intensified. The cartel was no longer unified by shared ambition. It was unified only by shared danger. As cooperation with authorities increased, false rumors were intentionally introduced into the organization. Escobar received conflicting reports about who had been arrested and who remained loyal. This information chaos forced him to change safe houses more frequently, alter routines, and reduce contact with even his closest associates. Every move increased his isolation. The final blow came when long-trusted intermediaries quietly stopped answering calls. Some had fled. Others were already under protection. A few were providing real-time intelligence. By the time Escobar realized how deeply the network had been compromised, his organization had already been hollowed out. The Medellin Cartel still existed on paper, but operationally, it was collapsing, and its most powerful figure was now increasingly alone by the early 1990s. Pablo Escobar was no longer protected by a powerful organization. He was protected by distance, mobility, and silence. Breaking that final layer required a different kind of pressure, one that relied less on raids and arrests, and more on signals, patterns, and time. Investigators shifted their focus from people to communications. Escobar had dramatically reduced his direct contact with lieutenants, but he still maintained regular communication with a small and carefully chosen circle. Most of these calls were brief, often no more than a few seconds. He avoided detailed conversations and used coded language. He believed short calls made him invisible. They did not signal monitoring teams. Began tracking radio and telephone activity across key areas of Medellin. Instead of listening for full conversations, analysts focused on technical indicators, call duration, connection frequency, and the sequence in which devices contacted each other. These patterns allowed investigators to map Escobar's communication network without needing to decode every word. Location analysis became the breakthrough. Each transmission left a technical footprint. By comparing signal strength, timing, and relay points, specialists could narrow the geographic area from which a call originated. Early results were entire neighborhoods were flagged, but as more data accumulated, the radius tightened. The process was slow. Escobar changed phones frequently. He rotated handsets. He relied on intermediaries. But human behavior creates repetition. He still called the same family members. He still trusted the same messengers. He still used certain communication windows that fit his routine. Those habits created consistency, and consistency created patterns. Investigators also layered human intelligence into the technical picture. Informants provided partial confirmation of which couriers were still active, which family members remained in contact, and which safe houses had recently been abandoned. Even negative information mattered. Knowing where Escobar was not became as valuable as knowing where he might be. Pressure intensified quietly. Security teams monitored neighborhoods without overt raids. Surveillance vehicles rotated regularly. Analysts updated location estimates after each intercepted signal. When multiple indicators overlapped, potential hideouts were prioritized. Escobar felt the tightening net. He moved more frequently. He avoided large compounds. He reduced travel distance. He stayed closer to trusted relatives. These defensive behaviors narrowed his operating space even further. Instead of disappearing into remote regions, he confined himself to familiar urban environments where he believed civilian density offered protection. It did the opposite. Urban infrastructure made signal analysis easier. Buildings reflected transmissions. Fixed relay points simplified triangulation. The very environment that felt safer also provided more reference data for analysts. The critical mistake came when Escobar re-established regular contact with his family. Emotion overruled strategy. He spoke longer. He checked in more frequently. He used repeat devices. Each call refined the location grid. Within days, analysts were no longer searching large sectors. They were watching specific blocks. The manhunt entered its final phase, when technical indicators, human reporting, and surveillance observations converged on a narrow area of Medellin. A small cluster of buildings, limited access points, clear movement patterns. Escobar had become detectable, not because he spoke to much, but because he spoke just enough. Technology had accomplished what years of raids and informants could not. It had given investigators something he could no longer outrun. By the time surveillance teams narrowed Pablo Escobar's location to a small section of Medellin, the objective was no longer symbolic. It was operational. The manhunt had reached its endgame. Specialized units were placed on immediate readiness. Entry teams, perimeter elements, and support personnel were positioned discreetly across nearby streets. Communications were restricted to essential channels only. The risk of leaks was treated as seriously as the risk of armed resistance. Escobar was still considered extremely dangerous. Although isolated, he remained protected by a small group of loyal gunmen and carried weapons at all times. Intelligence indicated that he would not surrender easily. Every movement was planned with the assumption that contact would be violent. When confirmation arrived that the signal source had remained stationary long enough to justify action, the order was given. Teams moved in quickly. The building was surrounded in minutes. Access points were sealed. Officers advanced toward the suspected location using coordinated entry procedures designed to limit escape routes and protect civilians nearby. Inside, Escobar attempted to flee. Rather than remaining inside the structure, he moved toward the rooftop, navigating narrow corridors and stairways as officers closed in from below. Surveillance teams tracked his movement through real time. Radio updates. Shots were exchanged. The pursuit lasted only minutes. On the rooftop, Escobar was fatally wounded after more than a decade of pursuit. Bombings, political pressure, and international cooperation. The most wanted man in Colombia was dead. The immediate reaction across the country was complex. Relief mixed with disbelief. For many citizens, Escobar had become an unavoidable presence in daily life. His death did not instantly erase the trauma left by years of violence, but it removed the central figure around which much of that violence had revolved. Operationally, the impact was rapid. Without Escobar's leadership, the Medellin Cartel fractured almost immediately. Remaining commanders lacked both the authority and the unified structure needed to maintain large-scale operations. Internal disputes intensified. Rival groups moved aggressively to absorb territories and routes. Law enforcement agencies capitalized on the collapse. Arrests accelerated. Financial networks were dismantled. Remaining laboratories and warehouses were seized. Informants who had stayed silent while Escobar lived began cooperating openly. The fear that had once protected the organization began to dissolve. Within months, the cartel that had dominated Colombia's criminal landscape for years no longer functioned as a centralized power. It had become a collection of disconnected remnants. However, the end of the Medellin Cartel did not mean the end of cocaine trafficking. New organizations would rise. New routes would emerge. The global demand that had fueled Escobar's empire remained, but something fundamental had changed. The myth of untouchability was gone. The man who had built a private empire through terror, bribery, and silence had been located, pursued and eliminated through coordination, intelligence, and persistence. The final operation did more than end a manhunt. It demonstrated that even the most powerful criminal networks could be dismantled when their leadership, communications, and protective systems were systematically stripped away. For Colombia, and for international law enforcement, the fall of Pablo Escobar marked the end of one era and the beginning of a very different fight. For years, Pablo Escobar controlled more than cocaine routes and gunmen. He controlled fear. He controlled silence. And for a long time, he controlled the truth. But no empire lasts forever, because even the most powerful criminal organizations eventually face one thing they cannot bribe, threaten, or erase. Exposure. The files were sealed. The names were hidden. The details were buried. But tonight, they are no longer redacted. This has been redacted. True crime files.